Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Steve Soreff, a member of the Federation Board and co-chair of the Holocaust Committee. We're here today, and thank you, Laurie Medrek, for joining us to hear this. Your family, you're a child of a survivor, and that story is very important to hear of your parents or whoever got you to this state, got here, what was like before the Holocaust, after, and how it is relevant now. This will be used as a broadcast on International Holocaust Day, January 27th, 2022, and the audience will be high school students, hopefully. In addition, I believe we will be archiving this because this message and story is very important for people to hear and listen to. Laurie, welcome. And what do you have?
Well, I first think it's important to know what life was like for my dad and the rest of my family before the Holocaust, because it gives you some kind of perspective, especially because it was a pretty normal life. I mean, my dad, he loved to talk about his childhood. His were very happy memories, like growing up in a fairly well-to-do family. I guess you'd call it middle class. His father had a clothing business, and his mom was a wonderful cook, a stay-at-home mom, but she was an avid volunteer. And he was the third of four children, and he loved to play soccer and boxing and ride his bike and fix bicycles. They lived in a little town called Ostrog, Poland, where 60% of the population, which was about 25,000 people, were Jewish.
Interesting. Again, that was before the war, and obviously things were normal and peaceful.
I wouldn't say peaceful. My dad talked about anti-Semitism kind of being the norm when he was growing up. He said, I don't think this is his quote, but he used to say it a lot. He said the Poles learned anti-Semitism from drinking their mother's milk.
That is so sad that we often hear that anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe even before Hitler or before the war.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've heard of pogroms. He never experienced those in his lifetime there. But there were things like he wasn't able to play soccer during the day on the fields where the Polish kids played.
Wow.
And they would have to play at night. And the kids would tease him by waving a piece of pork at him. And he loved to tell the story about how he wrestled one of them to the ground, and then he grabbed the pork out of his hand and he ate it just to freak the kid out. So, he didn't talk about violence per se, or of course pogroms at the time. There was just anti-Semitism hanging in the air. But later, his brother Lazar, he had been drafted into the Polish army, and he had walked all the way home from Warsaw to tell them about how the Jews were being rounded into ghettos and deported to labor camps and being made to wear armbands with the yellow Star of David. But my grandparents didn't want to believe it, but my dad took it very seriously. He ended up escaping during a night with a bunch of friends and leaving his family behind because they just didn't want to go. And he didn't find out until almost 4 years later that his parents and most of his extended family had been rounded up and killed. And his two sisters had survived by living with a Pentecostal family. It's a Protestant sect, posing as Polish orphans. And he never learned what happened to his brother. His parents were likely in a mass grave that he and I went to visit in 1994 when we took a trip back to Poland.
That is so horrific. And to realize, even in the face of the occupation, Nazi occupation, the level of denial was phenomenal.
Right. I mean, because you could never imagine something like this happening. His parents teased him that he was so going on a big vacation with his friends. And it was 3 days later that the Germans came into Ostrog after he left.
Again, that's a nice story about your father's brother that tried to save them.
So this is really, in a nutshell, the story. But when he came to America, he came with his sister, one of his sisters, who he was reunited with, and her new husband, Jack, who she had met in a DP camp. And they arrived in the U.S. on February 2nd, 1949, on a ship called the Marine Shark. And my Uncle Jack, my Aunt Anya's husband, he had survived 7 concentration camps.
Oh my God.
They had a total of $8 among the 3 of them to start their new lives here. And there was no subsidized housing, there was no welfare, no food stamps. They got jobs through an aunt who lived here, and they lived together until my cousin Leon was born. And then my dad moved out on his own, but they worked really hard and achieved the American dream. They became homeowners and businessmen and lived a middle-class life. And what really amazed me is that they could talk and laugh and cry all at the same time. They laughed hard, but their nightmares were always with them. But the human spirit, they learned to live and love again.
What port did your father arrive in?
He came into Ellis Island.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And you were nice. You had the ability to travel with your father. What was that like?
Yeah, well, when the Russian USSR opened the Iron Curtain, we were able to travel fairly freely back to Ostrog. We weren't able to obtain a visa because we were going to such a remote place. We actually ended up getting arrested, but my dad, who spoke fluent Polish and Russian, he was able to talk his way out of being detained. But it was so emotional. It was it was so bittersweet, actually, because there was nothing left. I mean, after the war, everything was in ruins and they razed everything. He wasn't able to locate his home, his father's business. We saw remnants of his synagogue, which they didn't tear the rest of it down. But just reliving that with my dad through his eyes was just extremely emotional. We were lucky enough to get in touch with someone who my aunt knew, who actually still lived there. To me, it's unbelievable that a Jew would still live there.
Wow.
There were a handful, but he became our eyes and ears to the past. He took us everywhere. He took us to, a Jewish cemetery that they had reestablished. And he took us to an area outside of a forest where 3,000 Jews had been shot, buried, and dead or alive. And we just assume that's where my grandparents are and the rest of his family.
That is so powerful. How has it affected you growing up?
Well, my dad would wake up a lot during the night with nightmares. He'd be screaming. He'd be having nightmares. So that's, we grew up with that. And he really didn't talk about it too much with us. We knew bits and pieces of what had happened. So I did sit down with him one day. I said, "You're going to tell me your life story, and I'm going to record it." And we did that. It was there. It was always hanging in the air. My mom was American. In fact, my mom's parents were also from Ostrog, Poland, and they had left a generation earlier.
Fascinating. This is America now. How can people understand, or what would you like them to understand about America now and then, and messages that you've learned?
Well, like I said in the beginning, my dad, he lived an ordinary, happy life, just like everybody here. It was a pretty good life until the Nazis came and unearthed the hatred on the Jewish people, which had existed for centuries anyway. And there were others too who weren't cooperative with the Nazis that were also subject to this hatred and annihilation. And the Jews, they were always living in diaspora. They were always in somebody else's country, exiled from their homeland of Israel for centuries and centuries, thousands of years. So, they were never truly welcome in other countries, though they wished and hoped and they fooled themselves into believing so. This pure evil was unleashed. And I think it's really important, though, to point out that there were these incredibly brave and heroic people who made it their mission to save Jews. As I said, my two aunts were hidden by a Pentecostal family for 3 years.
Wow.
They risked their lives. And in their words, this man and woman, my aunt overheard them during the night praying, saying, "Dear God, save the Israelite remnants." My aunt would call them the righteous Gentiles. And also, my dad, when he escaped, he worked on a railroad in Russia, and his boss had written him a letter of exemption from the Russian army, which saved his life too, because then he could travel back to Ostrog to find his sisters before the war was officially over. Anti-Semitism, it's always there. It just took a madman to unleash it like they did. But I don't think anti-Semitism is really rising. I think we're better at identifying it. And I would like to believe, and I do believe, that there's much, much more good than evil out there. I think the media loves to focus on acts of racism, but you don't hear much specifically about anti-Semitism. Jews have been subjected to prejudice and exclusion in our country and occasional acts of violence. But exposure to those fighting injustice is always welcome and has a positive influence. Those are the real heroes, and they're too rare.
Thank you very much for sharing this story of survival and resilience. Thank you.
What I would like to do, though, is for you and everyone to hear some words of wisdom, not from me. I'm just a child of survivors. I want you to hear these words right from the lips of my dad and my Auntie Ann and Uncle Jack. So if you would indulge me,
Well, this is the end of my autobiography. However, I would like to say a few words that a very, very small portion of the Russian, the Ukrainian and Polish population held the Jews are. I hope in the future Christians and Jews should God that such a thing should never happen again.
Looking back on my teen years, I have often wondered how we managed to emerge from the Nazi hell with our sanity intact. The world was silent and we were doomed. And whenever the so-called, the historical revisionists, the deniers, deny the Holocaust, I get very angry. How dare they? I'm still alive and I'm a witness to this terrible part of history. And it is already being denied. It never happened. I'm very disturbed by it, and it is not debatable. Thank you.
In my opinion, that the Holocaust question is not only the Jews. The Holocaust is for other nationalities too, because 5 million Christians were murdered during the Hitler's era. And that's why we shouldn't say this is only a Jewish problem. And as far as I'm concerned, unless people will learn and try to understand what happened, that can happen again. Not necessarily for Jews or Irish or blacks, it can happen to anybody. And to avoid this, I think we should teach more about the Holocaust. And if people will understand what happened and try to prevent the thing, and that will never happen again.